Good afternoon and welcome to this results webinar for State of Flux's 2014 Global SRM Research Report. My name is Mel Schutz. I'm Head of SRM for State of Flux and responsible for delivering this report, the sixth in a succession of global SRM research reports that State of Flux have produced. Since 2009, this piece of research has been central to what State of Flux have been doing in terms of providing research and best practice feedback to organisations across the globe, and it's also central to our own consultancy practice. This year, the research is bigger and covers more geographic areas of the globe than in previous years. 550 companies responded to our 2014 research. Around half of those in Europe, the rest split between North America and Australasia, with a small number in Asia. The industry sectors that we've covered again has expanded, over 20 industry sectors represented, predominantly from financial services, manufacturing, oil and gas, but also a good representation from other sectors. Just by way of information around this webinar, it'll last around 45 minutes. The lines are muted, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions by typing into the chat window. We should have enough time at the end of the webinar to pick up at least some of those questions, so please feel free to ask, and we'll do what we can at the end of the webinar to address those questions. For those of you that are familiar with our research, and what I should say also is a big thank you for those that have completed the research. What we do in this field in terms of collecting that research and feeding it back to numerous organisations is impossible without the ongoing support of the respondents to our survey. So again, a big thank you for that. And those of you that are familiar with previous research reports will recognise this model. It represents 6 pillars of SRM. It's the basis on which we organise our research, and it's also what we consider to be the key elements of SRM. We've developed this over 10 years. The 6 pillars are all important elements of SRM, and we would maintain that organisations that are achieving good levels of capability in each of these 6 pillars are those that are more likely to see good outcomes from their SRM programs. Over the course of our research, we've been able to establish a maturity model and a methodology for benchmarking. The model itself has 4 levels. It goes from undeveloped through to advanced, and it takes into account all 6 pillars of SRM. This year, similar to previous years, we've identified groups that we would call our benchmark groups. We have a group of leaders, we have fast followers, and we have followers. This year, the leaders are represented by this line on the chart. Their SRM practices on average would be towards the top of the established band, and they have an SRM index which is an average of 4.1. The next group are fast followers. These are still organisations that are very capable, maybe not as far advanced in their SRM journey as the leaders, but certainly moving in the right direction. Their average SRM index is 3.5, which puts them just into the established level on this model. The final benchmarking group are the followers. Again, organisations which have pretty good SRM capability, but again, perhaps would be less mature and less well developed than the other 2 groups. Their average is 2.9 in terms of the SRM index, and that would put them just at the top of the developing band on our maturity model. Incidentally, organisations that have responded to our research are able to plot their individual responses on this model, and if any organisation that has completed the research or would like to complete the research and get that feedback, please contact us at our website or via inquiries@stateofflux.co.uk, and we can arrange for that to happen. So moving on to the feedback from this year's research, we've divided this feedback into the 6 pillars, the first of which being business drivers and value. Now this pillar represents the relationship between the important business drivers for investing and committing time and effort to SRM and the value that it creates. So firstly, we've looked at a number of the key business drivers. This year, 88% of organisations believe that cost reduction is the most important business driver. Not far behind that is risk. In fact, in 2013, risk was seen to be marginally the most important business driver. But clearly, risk and cost are 2 of the main considerations. Interestingly, financial services consistently put risk at the top of their list of business drivers, and they are one of the industry sectors which are reporting a higher level of benefits in that area, with 72% of financial services organisations reporting that SRM has effectively reduced their risk exposure. Another important business driver is innovation. This is seen as being an important topic by 69% of our respondents overall, and 81% of the leaders group. We'll explore a little later in this webinar the dichotomy, which is the importance that's placed on innovation as a business driver, but the lack of success that many organisations are reporting in terms of turning that into reality. Moving on to value, 46% of the leaders are reporting post-contract financial benefits of over 4%. We recognise that the way in which organisations capture and report financial benefit can vary, but we've been asking this question in a very similar way for 6 years, and consistently the leaders are reporting financial benefits, in some cases just over 4%, in other cases significantly higher than that. So we have a level of confidence that these are genuine financial benefits which SRM is driving. Leaders are also far more likely to be receiving customer of choice benefits. These are the less tangible benefits that result from positioning an organisation to be one which is preferred as a customer by their key suppliers. The type of benefits here would be represented by access to and retention of the best supplier resource, good exposure and good coverage at the executive level, improved effort around account management, and also preferential treatment when problems arise in terms of material shortages or component shortages. Business drivers and value, there's a relationship between the 2 that we've tried to illustrate in this extract from the report. This chart lists the main business drivers that organisations have identified, and the top line represents the proportion of respondents that believe that those business drivers were either important or very important to their organisation. So if we look on the left-hand side of the chart, it's clear to see that cost reduction and cost avoidance and risk reduction were seen as being important or very important by over 80% of our respondents. However, the second line on this chart represents the proportion of respondents that have reported benefits, and that, you can see, is considerably lower than the number that have identified the business drivers as being important. So for us, this represents a significant gap between the important business drivers that organisations are identifying and their ability to derive benefits and value in those areas. One would expect a gap to exist, but in some cases that gap is quite significant, with less than 50% of the organisations that have identified a business driver as being important actually identifying benefits in that area. And interestingly, a number of the larger gaps are in the customer of choice area. So typically a customer of choice benefit could be getting preferred access to scarce materials and capacity, particularly when there are problems in the supply chain. That was seen as being an important business driver by over 75% of the organisations that responded to our survey, and yet only just over 20% of organisations are actually seeing that as a benefit. So what we're seeing here really is perhaps an issue or a challenge for organisations to focus more initiatives on those important business drivers. We think that possibly many organisations are casting their net a little too wide in terms of trying to achieve all of the business drivers instead of focusing on a smaller number which are more important to the business. The next pillar that we're looking at is stakeholder engagement and support, and I guess that would be considered self-explanatory in some cases, but SRM being a cross-business, cross-functional activity, it really happens with the permission of those stakeholders. Unless the business is engaged, unless senior management are supportive, then SRM has very little chance of success. So here we're seeing some challenges. The top chart represents the level of senior executive and senior management stakeholder and support being achieved by the leaders, the fast followers, and the followers. And what we can see is it's clear that the leaders have the greatest level of strong and active engagement from their senior stakeholders. But having said that, that only represents just over 40% of those leaders. So clearly there are still some challenges around getting more engagement from the senior management population. The second group of stakeholders that we try to characterise are the business and operational stakeholders. Those are stakeholders in the business that have a more day-to-day interaction with suppliers. And here we can see the situation around strong and active engagement is in fact worse. And even in the case of leaders, only around 30% of leaders believe that they have strong and active engagement from their operational colleagues within the business. What is interesting is that given the acknowledged importance of stakeholder engagement and support, even for leaders, only 1 in 4 have a stakeholder management plan in place, and when we expand that question to the wider population, that figure drops to only 1 in 7. So clearly there is an opportunity to focus more on engaging with key stakeholder groups, and creating a stakeholder management plan would be a really good step in that direction. The third stakeholder group that we characterise are in fact the suppliers themselves, sometimes not considered necessarily to be stakeholders, but nonetheless absolutely vital to making SRM work. Interestingly, again, engagement with those suppliers is important, but only 43% of companies have actively gathered feedback from their suppliers in the last 12 months. We recognise that supplier feedback is often gathered perhaps through anecdotes or in an informal way, but in terms of a more structured, formal approach to engaging a group of suppliers to understand how an organisation is perceived as a customer, relative strengths and weaknesses, etc., only 43% of companies have done that in the last 12 months. Just to pause for a moment from running through the 6 pillars and take a quick look at the sell side. Over the last 3 years, we've engaged with a number of sell-side organisations as part of our research, really to validate and to test the feedback that we're getting from the buy side. So what I've done is just pull out a few extracts from that sell-side feedback. Firstly, it's absolutely evident that creating trust in a relationship is important. It's seen as the single most important relationship attribute by the sell side. Interestingly, 50% of both the buy side and the sell side maintain that SRM has had a positive impact on negotiations, and that is really as a result of both trust being established in relationships and also the kind of behavioural change that SRM is intended to promote. However, there are challenges. Less than 1/3 of the sell-side organisations that we spoke to believe that they are strongly engaged in their customers' SRM programs, and 35% remain unconvinced that the customer or the buy side is fully committed to that SRM approach. And again, to relate back to the previous question around supplier engagement. Only 50% of suppliers have been asked for feedback in the last 12 months. So there really are still some challenges around getting suppliers fully engaged in the SRM process. What our engagement with the sell side also revealed was that customer of choice is real. This concept of customer of choice has been discussed more frequently over recent years, and in some cases the very concept of it or the existence of it has been challenged. But the feedback from the supplier side is pretty clear. 60% do make conscious choices in terms of putting more effort into account management with customers they prefer to do business with, and that preference isn't only based on the size of the spend or the revenue or the profitability of that account. It's also very clearly related to the ease of doing business and how that organisation is to work with. Around half of the companies that we spoke to believe that for those customers of choice, they do go the extra mile and they put in that extra level of commitment. And around 50% work more actively on continuous improvement. So these are real dividends, these are real benefits from being considered a customer of choice for key suppliers. We recognise it's not possible to be that customer of choice for all suppliers, but certainly organisations have the opportunity to work harder to position themselves more favourably compared to their competitors when it comes to those areas of the relationship where the supplier has a degree of choice and can exercise that choice. There does need to be more work around influencing those suppliers and driving that preferential treatment, particularly around securing and maintaining the best resource, getting prioritisation when suppliers are scarce for reasons within the supply chain, and also being the point of first refusal for supplier-generated innovation. Okay, so going back to the overall results, the third pillar in our model is governance and process. This really represents the structure, the operating models, the processes and the tools that are put in place to support SRM. We frequently talk to organisations that quote good examples of supplier relationships, many of which are based more on personal relationships and long-standing relationships between senior executives. Now it's clear that those relationships are important and that supplier relationship management has very much a people focus. However, that shouldn't be the only basis on which relationships are built. Increasingly, we see evidence that senior executives in organisations are changing more frequently, so the real over-reliance on those personal relationships should really be avoided. They're important, but they need to be underpinned with the right governance structures and the processes to support the relationship to provide that continuity if those individuals should change. Part of governance and process is looking at the operating model to be adopted, and this has been a challenge for organisations for some time. It now seems that we've reached more of a steady state, and 7 in 10 companies are putting SRM process ownership and the lead for SRM within the procurement function. Now that may be within a centralised procurement function, or it would be within the procurement function that is devolved into the business, but nonetheless that's 7 in 10 organisations that consider procurement to be the home and the main driver behind SRM. So that does put a big responsibility on procurement to step up to that challenge, to take ownership of the process and to develop the skills and the capabilities to deliver good SRM on behalf of the business. However, that's not the case in all organisations or indeed in all industry sectors. What we can see from this analysis is that food and beverages are most likely to have the procurement-centric operating model, but as you can see, most industry sectors are biased towards that, but probably more so in food and beverages than anywhere else. At the other end of the spectrum, financial services and the public sector are most likely to have SRM in the business compared to other sectors, but even those industry sectors still have a large proportion of their SRM activities within the procurement function. Another aspect, an important aspect of governance and process is segmentation. Again, we've reached a steady state in terms of the proportion of organisations that have done a formal supplier segmentation activity. It's been around 18-10 or 80% for the last few years. What is changing, however, is the range of criteria that are being applied to segmentation. Still, you can see from this analysis that the level of spend with the supplier, the level of dependency, the level of risk are certainly the criteria that are being used most frequently. However, what we are seeing is that additional criteria are being introduced, which influences the segmentation to a certain degree. Spend and risk still dominate, but that wider set of criteria is now increasingly being used. And that includes things like the supplier's potential to create additional value from the relationship, a supplier's innovation and technology capabilities, and even indeed the supplier's appetite to collaborate and to work in partnership. These are all being factored into that segmentation process to ensure that organisations in completing segmentation are focusing their time, their effort and their resource on the relationships that will make the most difference to the business. And that isn't always in terms of spend and risk. That can also be in terms of looking at a potential future opportunity. Another aspect of governance and process are what we would term to be the strong foundations that are required. For those of you that are familiar with our research or with the approach that we take to SRM, this model might be familiar. What it's intended to illustrate is this building block approach to SRM. The whole procurement life cycle starts with category management, category planning, etc. It moves into strategic sourcing and into contract negotiation and contract award. At that point, and indeed even before that point, good risk management needs to have been introduced, contract management and performance management. And these are really the building blocks or the foundations for good SRM. However, what we see when we ask organisations about how robust those processes are and whether that foundation for SRM is in place, we get some feedback which can be considered to be kind of concern. Only 40% of companies report that they have robust performance management in place. And that question wasn't intended to represent the whole of the supplier base, which can run to many thousands. The question was about robust performance management in place for key suppliers. So this suggests that less than half of those key suppliers are being managed in terms of performance in a way that will underpin SRM. It's a similar picture in terms of contract management being the control of the contract in terms of managing obligations, contract change, administering the contract in terms of review dates or key milestones. So again, less than half the organisations believe that is in place and is working effectively for their key suppliers. The third of these analysis is around risk management, and this has always been problematic. Most good strategic sourcing processes have risk management built in. Risk is mitigated as far as possible throughout that sourcing process, but there will always be some residual risk which goes forward into the contract implementation. And it's always been problematic as to how this risk is managed, who owns it going forward. But the conclusion we can reach from the feedback that we have through our research is that only 38% of companies report that they have robust risk management in place. And again, this was around key suppliers and key contracts. So again, three areas where we've received feedback from our research which would be cause for concern in a number of organisations. Not only because it tends to undermine the case for SRM. If performance, contracts and risk are not being managed effectively, then engaging the business in a conversation about SRM really won't yield many benefits until those fundamentals in place. But this also represents risk to the business at an operational and a financial level. So moving on to the fourth pillar, which is people and skills. And what we try and avoid in looking at people and skills is avoiding leaping into a discussion around training. SRM capability in the organisation needs to be built, and there are key steps which need to be followed to build that capability. Training is indeed one of those important steps, but it really should start with an understanding of what SRM is, what it's intended to achieve, and what the deliverables are, and defining a role for SRM, a role which may be, and we'll look at this in a moment, it may be a dedicated role in the organisation, or it might form part of a wider set of responsibilities. But nonetheless, the SRM role needs to be defined. It needs to be defined in a way which will attract and retain the best talent in the organisation. So 52% of the organisations that we spoke to have defined that SRM role in some way. 62% of those have then gone on to define the SRM skill set. So this is an activity like developing a competency framework and understanding what the key skills are in order to deliver effective SRM. The next step is to have completed a competency framework, and then is to assess the capabilities of those people in the organisation that have SRM or supply management responsibilities. And only 33% of organisations have taken that next step in terms of completing a competency assessment, which in turn will then lead to an understanding of the development and training needs of individuals. So we would see it as really important that more organisations are building this capability in that systematic way, and then investing in training in order to meet the needs that are identified through that process. Another important element of building that capability is looking at job design and how SRM is best executed in the business. And again, there are various approaches which have been adopted. Essentially, what the research has told us over the last few years is that there are essentially two camps. There's the camp that looks at SRM as being a role or a job which is dedicated, which is full-time, one which demands a particular skill set. And we're finding that increasingly leaders in particular are opting for that dedicated role. It might involve managing a number of suppliers, but nonetheless it's a role which is dedicated around supplier relationship management and isn't distracted by other responsibilities. Around about 50% of organisations, for a variety of reasons, not least of which are constraints around resource and budget, are combining that role with category management. So this again reflects the high proportion of SRM activity which takes place within procurement, and when that is happening, and it's usually as part of a role combined with category management or sourcing. A number of organisations have the role positioned in other areas outside of procurement, and as we indicated earlier, that might well include financial services and the public sector. But the key takeaway here is that around about 50% of the leaders are making that step forward and dedicating resource into an SRM role. Having described the building of capability as a process, and an important step in that process is indeed to identify training. And what we've done is to try and analyse in a single slide the responses to 3 questions within our survey. The first question was that we asked organisations to look at this list of the kind of skills and competencies required for SRM and identify which of them they thought were the most important. And the top 5 that were identified were strategic thinking, cross-functional working, change management, communication, and building trust in relationships. So of all those skills, all of which have relevance and are important in some way to SRM, the 5 considered the most important were the ones that I've just described. We then went on to ask 2 follow-up questions. Firstly, which of the skills listed were the most in need of improvement, and secondly, what training had been provided in the last 12 months against those skills. And essentially what that gives us is a supply and demand gap. What we've got is, in many cases, a significant demand in terms of skills that need improvement compared with limited supply. And incidentally, as you can see from the highlighted skills on this chart, the biggest gaps are in many of the most important areas. So probably the biggest gap of any is the ability to develop strategic thinking. So for supplier managers to manage relationships, looking at the bigger picture, looking at the future development of the relationship. Cross-functional working is an absolutely vital element, and again, there's a significant gap between the perceived need for improving those skills and the level of training that's been provided. So again, this is a really powerful picture that supports a case for investing more significantly in training going forward. Incidentally, there are a couple of areas where training has been adequately provided, and in some cases the suggestion is that there's more training provided than there is demand. And again, this is no surprise given the proportion of SRM that's conducted within the procurement function. So contract and commercial expertise, the demand and supply are pretty well balanced. And when it comes to negotiation skills, the suggestion here is that there's probably more training being delivered or provided than the organisation feels is strictly necessary. But that's an interesting picture based on current experience. What in fact it does is causes slightly more concern that this gap isn't going to be adequately addressed if only 50% of the companies report that they're planning any SRM training within the next 12 months. So it's evident that this gap hasn't been recognised in organisations, or there isn't sufficient budget or determination to put training solutions in place. Okay, moving on to the fifth of the 6 pillars of SRM, and that's information and technology. This pillar really looks at the importance that organisations place on information and the capability they have in terms of technology or system support. Clearly, information should really be at the heart of relationships. The ability to share information, to access information, to make decisions based on good information is absolutely vital to the relationship. And what we're seeing is that organisations are sharing information with their suppliers, but it's actually the leaders who are more likely to be sharing the more strategic type of information. And this is information which is primarily looking forward at the future of the relationship, at the future risks and opportunities that might exist. So the leaders are almost twice as likely to be sharing information around their company strategy, around the strategy for a particular relationship, providing guidance around improvement or innovation targets, providing relevant company information, sharing their product or technology roadmaps, and sharing their business development plans. So again, this is an example of where there's a correlation between the kind of activities that leaders are engaged in and the levels of benefits and value that are being derived from their SRM programs. Taking a broader look at feedback on technology, and this is interesting and probably consistent with the last few years in where we've seen information and technology lagging behind the other attributes of SRM. And that situation is probably more exacerbated this year than in previous years. The overall technology enablement of SRM overall has dropped between 2013 and 2014. Now that drop is either in reality, or it could be symptomatic of increasing levels of frustration that organisations and people are demonstrating in terms of how long it's taking to get decent technology support for what is a really important business operation. only 8% of the respondents are using technology significantly. There is the opportunity to use technology to support SRM in many different ways, but a very small proportion believe that they're getting that level of support from their technology solutions. And those organisations that are using technology are generally very dissatisfied with it. 57% of respondents believe that their technology is either poor or very poor. The kind of barriers they articulate are around a lack of functionality. They're operating with systems which are disparate, lacking integration, having to go to different systems to pick up different aspects of information, and then in many cases having to collate that information and use tools such as Excel to create information that can be shared. Most companies where they have information and they're looking to share it are using internal systems such as SharePoint. Relatively few organisations are able to share information effectively with external parties and in particular with suppliers. And as I said, 81% of companies are still using Excel to create and manage their supplier management reporting. Excel is a really good tool, and we've seen examples of some very clever use of Excel. Unfortunately, it's really not scalable. It's really something that very quickly becomes inconsistent as individuals start to develop and introduce different characteristics into their analysis. So for an organisation which has aspirations to manage SRM consistently, to report and share information in an efficient and effective way, I have to say, Excel really can't be seen as the future. So why is information and technology, and in particular, why is technology considered to be important and something that organisations aspire to have and to introduce more effectively? Firstly, they believe that information management and reporting and sharing of information is absolutely key. Organisations want to see more information around supplier performance. They want to be able to manage suppliers in one place, and that's to create both an information repository and a collaborative place or a collaborative space where organisations can work together. And the fourth on this list is they see a real importance around maintaining oversight of supplier management. As we said earlier, it's clear that supplier management, SRM, is multifunctional, business-wide. It can even be global, and it's important to understand for consistency and for the maintenance of good practice what activities are happening, and technology certainly can enable organisations to understand more clearly what supplier management is taking place. There are positives. There's a real correlation between the organisations, albeit relatively few, who are implementing technology effectively and the level of benefits that are being derived from SRM. So when technology is deployed, SRM benefits typically are between 2 to 4%. Last of the 6 pillars, and then we'll be able to wrap up and take some of your questions. This last pillar is a little different in that it's representing a number of outputs. If the other 5 pillars are being delivered effectively and efficiently, relationships will develop. So if business drivers and value are understood, good stakeholder engagements being achieved, including supplier engagement, good processes, good people, good technology, they will all result in a more effective and mature relationship with suppliers. However, we would maintain there are some elements which can be addressed more proactively. One is about creating trust, and that really does depend very much on openness, on honesty, on a willingness to share information. So for 93% of organisations, creating trust is seen as a key aspect of building good relationships. And if you remember, that was mirrored by the sell-side organisations. Good relationships should have innovation as part of their DNA. So good ideas, information should flow freely in organisations. And as we said before, 81% of leaders believe that supplier innovation is a really important part of SRM. However, only 43% of companies see themselves as good at harnessing supplier innovation. And we see that as the potential area where more investment can be made in developing strategy and developing process, and this in itself will help with relationship development and creating a more positive culture. 6 out of 10 organisations collaborate on a regular basis with their suppliers. I think that number could certainly be higher. When we look at the kind of collaboration that's taking place, it's often around collaborative problem solving. It's almost collaboration being forced on organisations rather than something that they're actively seeking to do. So we would maintain that a more proactive approach to collaboration, looking at joint development activities, looking at joint innovation, looking at joint improvement, is a way of driving more active collaboration and harnessing the resources of both organisations. And again, as we mentioned earlier, 64% of leaders report better negotiation outcomes as a result of SRM. And this is really, in a way, indicative of the kind of change behaviours that SRM promotes. And in fact, those behaviours, when exhibited in that really difficult environment of negotiation, can it seems, have really positive outcomes. Interestingly, even though organisations recognise the importance of understanding their relationships, relatively few use any kind of tool. So only less than a third of the companies that we spoke to are using any kind of 360 relationship assessment or relationship diagnostic tool. But again, this correlation between what leaders are doing and the benefits they're getting is clear. Leaders are more than twice as likely to be using a 360 type of relationship assessment as part of their SRM approach. So, as we draw to a close, we're running up against our 45-minute target. So I'll close quickly with what we believe are 10 takeaways or 10 essentials of SRM, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for questions. So I'll run through these quickly. You'll realise that most of these have been brought out in the last 40 minutes or so. So I hope that this represents a recap. Firstly, it's really important to understand where you are now in terms of an SRM program. Be that at the start of an SRM program where something like a voice of the supplier or an engagement with internal stakeholders will help you understand how SRM is currently perceived, how you as an organisation are perceived. If you're further down the road in terms of an SRM development, then just take time out to do a brief diagnostic. Is SRM delivering what the business needs? Are effective governance models in place? Are they actually being deployed and used? So it's always, I think, beneficial to take time out and just to understand where an organisation is in terms of that development of SRM. That could lead to more focused effort around closing the business drivers and benefits gap. This is really around focusing on those important business drivers and putting clear activities and initiatives in place to drive value, and that in turn supports the business case, supports stakeholder engagement, and demonstrates the benefit of SRM. Engage proactively with stakeholders, so that's clearly a lot more effort that needs to go into managing relationships with key senior stakeholders and with the operational areas of the business. And also the suppliers, so we need to listen to suppliers. We need to use tools such as Voice of the Supplier to really understand how we're perceived as a customer, what our strengths and weaknesses are from the supplier perspective, and indeed how we're positioned as a customer of choice. Use segmentation to really focus effort on those relationships that make the most difference to the business, and that could well include expanding the criteria that are used. Define the SRM role and invest in training. So that is looking at developing capability in its holistic sense. So right from defining the role of SRM in the organisation through to identifying the development needs of individuals and delivering those training solutions. The opportunity is there to collaborate using technology, to share information more effectively, to create that that ability to extend your organization and to connect effectively with both stakeholders and with suppliers. The current use of technology is way below where it needs to be to properly enable good SRM. Look inside those relationships. Use that 360 type of analysis to really understand the key attributes of your relationship, engaging both your internal stakeholders and suppliers, and develop an action plan as a result of that analysis. Develop a supplier innovation strategy. This dichotomy between innovation as an aspiration and our ability to deliver it must be a missed opportunity, and most organizations would benefit from really looking at their innovation strategy and the processes they have to support it. And finally, we haven't touched on this before, but leverage the sell side. We've been talking to key account managers, key account management organizations, and in many cases that has developed into a number of objectives and a number of strategies which are very similar to SRM. Key account managers are looking to create more value for the customer. They're looking to introduce innovation to give themselves an edge on their competitors. These are really the same objectives that SRM has in many cases. So look for opportunities to collaborate, look for opportunities to leverage what the sell side is also trying to achieve. Okay, that concludes the webinar. We are tight for time, so I do apologise that we won't get to as many of your questions as I'd like to. But I really would like to just pick up on a couple that, if I can. The first one that I can see having come up was where do you see SRM in terms of importance within the procurement profession in general and in the business? I guess I can only express a personal opinion here, but I've been involved in procurement for many years, and I really see SRM as the natural evolution of the procurement function. Procurement has been on a 10, 15, 20-year journey to drag itself from the back office, from its ordering, expediting, material control type of discipline into a strategic function. And as we're more successful in putting in place long-term contracts with rationalising the supply base, SRM becomes that much more important. And the role, I think, of procurement in future will be to migrate progressively from sourcing and category management into SRM as its primary focus. Second question I've got is around the concept of customer choice, and is it more relevant in larger organisations working with smaller suppliers? It's an interesting dilemma. I think customer choice is important no matter what type of supplier relationship you have, but clearly where an organisation is working with bigger suppliers, and you may not be a naturally strategic customer, then you can't change that. You can't become a bigger customer. What you can become is a customer that it's easier to do business with, a customer that has where that supplier has the opportunity to demonstrate preferencing or exercise some choice. It's your organisation that will benefit. It is also more of a challenge with bigger companies who perhaps consider themselves almost to be a customer of choice by right. So if they spend a huge amount of money, then why wouldn't they be a customer of choice? And in some cases that might be true. However, I think they need to recognise that they may not only be the only big customer of a supplier. There will be opportunities where that supplier will make choices and will differentiate between the level of service that they provide. So therefore, even as a big company, looking at developing customer of choice attributes will be beneficial. Okay, we are 5 minutes over time, so I do apologise for that overrun. I'd like to thank you for taking the time, and I apologise for not being able to get to more of your questions. But please, if you'd like more information about our SRM research, about our report, if you'd like the opportunity potentially to benchmark your own organisation in terms of of the leaders that we've identified, then please do get in touch. You can contact us at inquiries@stateofflux.co.uk or of course via our website. So again, thank you for your time, and we hope to be talking to you again soon. Thank you very much.